Far from the shining worlds of the inner systems, silence ruled the dark edges of the galaxy. There were places where light from nearby stars barely reached, where dust clouds swallowed entire constellations, and where signals often vanished without a trace. It was in this silence that a desperate message began to move through the endless void. It came from a small colony world, once full of life and trade, now burning under the fire of an ancient empire known as the Karth Dominion. The message was not long or poetic. It was a simple call for help, a last cry from a civilization that knew it was about to be erased. It carried the sound of fear, of people begging anyone, anything to listen. For weeks, the transmission bounced between relay stations, passing through forgotten channels. Many heard it but ignored it. The Karth Dominion was not a name that others dared to oppose. Their fleet was massive, their power absolute, their cruelty unmatched. They had crushed hundreds of systems, enslaved entire species, and erased planets from maps just to make a point. Every empire, every federation, every council knew the cost of defiance. So they looked away and stayed silent. But when the message reached human space, something changed. On Earth, deep within the Terran command network, a quiet alert flashed across the screens. The officers who received it at first thought it was a normal distress call, one of the many that came from border systems each month. But when they played the message and heard the fear in the alien voices, the room went still. No one spoke. They could hear the explosions in the background, the trembling voices, the panic. There was something in those sounds that humans could not ignore. It reminded them of old wars, of their own cities burning centuries ago, of the times when they had cried out and no one had answered. Humanity had changed since then. They had spread across hundreds of worlds, built fleets, learned to live among the stars, but they had not forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. Within hours, the message reached the highest levels of the Terran Union. The Council gathered in emergency session. Some argued that it was not their fight, that the Dominion's wrath would not stop with one rescue, that they were risking everything. Others said that if they ignored this plea, they would lose something far greater than ships or soldiers. They would lose their humanity. The debate was short. The decision was made. The fleet was to be mobilized. Humanity would answer the call. Across the colonies, orders spread like fire. Massive shipyards lit up as engines powered on. Dockyards that had been quiet for decades came alive again. Dreadnoughts that had not seen battle in years were refitted and armed. Crew members were recalled from leave. Families said hurried goodbyes, and entire manufacturing worlds shifted to war production. Every screen, every broadcast spoke with the same calm message. The fleet was moving. The stars would soon know the sound of human engines again. To the outer colonies and trade worlds, the news was almost unbelievable. Humanity had been peaceful for decades, focused on building, exploring, and creating. But deep inside there had always been that part of them that could not sit idle in the face of cruelty. Generations had passed since Earth's last Great War, but the memory of struggle was in their blood. They were children of a world that had seen both beauty and horror. When others turned away, humans stepped forward. It was something that other species never truly understood. Humanity did not fight because it wanted to, but because it could not bear to see the innocent suffer. In less than a week, the fleet gathered at the edge of the Sol system. It was larger than anything seen in centuries. From small escort frigates to towering battleships, the formation stretched for thousands of kilometers. Hundreds of thousands of crew members worked in silence, their faces calm but their eyes hard. They knew what they were about to do. They had heard the message. Some of them played it again before launch, just to remember why they were going. Among the ships, the flagship Resolute stood at the center. It was a massive vessel, older than most of its crew, yet still unmatched in strength. Its hull was black, built to absorb radar and light. It carried more firepower than entire planetary fleets. From its command bridge, the fleet admiral watched as the final ships joined formation. He gave no speech, no grand orders. He simply looked out into the stars and said one word: go. The fleet began its journey through folded space. For a brief moment, space itself seemed to twist and ripple. Then, one by one, the ships vanished, leaving behind only silence. To anyone watching from afar, it would have looked like the stars themselves had blinked. In the days that followed, reports spread across communication networks. Traders, miners, and scouts all spoke of strange readings, of gravity waves moving through the void. Some believed it was a new weapon. Others whispered that humanity had unleashed something ancient. As the fleet traveled, messages came from nearby civilizations, urging them to turn back. The Karth Dominion, they said, was unstoppable. They had erased entire sectors. Even the largest empires had fallen before them. But humanity did not respond. They had already decided. This was not a political move or an attempt at expansion. It was a rescue, a final stand for those who had no one left. On board the Resolute, the crew worked in silence. Engineers monitored reactor levels. Navigators checked jump coordinates again and again. Pilots ran through combat drills. There was no music, no celebration. Only focus. Some were young, never having seen battle. Others were veterans with memories of the old wars. But all of them shared the same quiet determination. They were not just soldiers. They were the answer to a cry for help. Outside, the stars streaked past as the ships moved faster than light. The journey would take hours, but to the crew it felt longer. Each moment was filled with thought. What if they were too late? What if the colony had already fallen? What if the enemy was waiting? No one spoke these fears aloud, but everyone felt them. Yet even in that silence, there was a shared understanding. If they arrived to find nothing but ashes, they would still fight. Back on Earth, the people watched the sky. News networks carried updates of the fleet's progress. Families gathered around screens, waiting for news, whispering prayers, sending messages of support that would never reach their loved ones in time. The whole world seemed to hold its breath. Humanity had gone to war again, not for themselves, but for others. Meanwhile, on the edge of known space, the Karth Dominion continued its assault. Their ships were black and red, covered in armor that looked like bone. They moved with cruel precision, destroying everything in their path. On the surface of Tylar Prime, the alien defenders were nearly gone. Fires covered the horizon. The last communication towers were falling. The skies were filled with debris and plasma fire. The few remaining survivors huddled in bunkers, praying that someone had heard their cries. And far away, through the endless dark, humanity's fleet drew closer. Their weapons were armed. Their targeting systems were already locked on the enemy positions. The moment the coordinates matched, their arrival would tear the sky open. None of the crew knew what awaited them on the other side, but none of them hesitated. They had left behind their home, their comfort, and their safety for a simple reason. They could not stand by while others suffered. As the final jump sequence began, the Resolute's engines pulsed brighter than the surrounding stars. The Admiral gave his last order. There was no emotion in his voice, only calm resolve. "Activate the gate." The stars bent, light twisted, and space itself screamed. Then in an instant, the darkness of the void shattered as hundreds of human warships burst into existence above Tylar Prime. The Dominion fleet, still firing on the surface below, froze as sensors overloaded. They had no time to react. Humanity had arrived, silent and ready, their weapons burning with power. The battle that followed would be remembered for generations. But in that first moment before the first shot was fired, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The message that had started as a cry for help had reached those who refused to ignore it. And now the answer had come in the form of an entire fleet, forged from the will of a species that had once been weak but had learned to stand for others. In that silence before war, every human heart aboard the fleet beat the same steady rhythm. They were not there for glory or revenge. They were there because someone had called for help, and that was enough. When the human fleet came out of folded space, the stars seemed to ripple and twist around them. The airless sky above Tylar Prime burned with strange light as hundreds of human warships appeared in tight formation, each one black and silent. Like a shadow against the fire of the nearby sun, the Karth Dominion ships that were orbiting the planet froze for a few seconds, their sensors blinded by the sudden arrival, their command channels filled with confusion. They had expected nothing. They believed the system was already theirs. But now the void itself had opened and something terrible had come through. On the flagship, the crew of the Resolute worked fast. Their faces calm, though their hearts raced. Every weapon system came alive. Reactors reached full power, targeting systems locked onto hundreds of enemy signatures that filled the space ahead. Of them, the Admiral stood at the center of the command deck, silent, and still his eyes fixed on the planet below. Where flames still glowed through the thick clouds, he did not need to speak. The order was already understood by every human on every ship across the entire fleet. Humanity had come not to negotiate, not to send warnings, but to end this. The first strike began without a sound. Rods of solid tungsten were released from orbit, falling faster than light could travel through the atmosphere. They hit the Dominion ships that were bombarding the planet, tearing through their armor like paper explosions filled the dark. The enemy fleet broke apart trying to form a line, but the human ships moved faster than anything they had ever seen. The cruisers spread out in a wide arc, covering each other. The destroyers unleashed railgun fire that glowed like lightning across the sky, and the carriers released clouds of small attack drones that flew like swarms of metal bees, each one armed with miniature fusion warheads that darted between enemy ships, leaving trails of light behind them. Within minutes, the quiet darkness had become a storm of color, fire, and movement. The Dominion's command ships tried to call reinforcements, but their communications were jammed by human counter systems. They launched their own fighters, but they never made it close. Human defense grids tracked every single one and tore them apart with precision beams of plasma and kinetic slugs. Nothing could get through the Dominion's pride. The massive warship called the Harak tried to turn its main guns toward the human fleet. It was nearly 10 kilometers long, a monster of steel and fire, but before it could even charge its main weapon, a line of human dreadnoughts opened fire. Their shots hit at the same time, and the Harak vanished in a silent flash of light. When the glare faded, there was nothing left but fragments and silence. The aliens watching from the surface could hardly believe what they were seeing. They had been sure that their end had come. Their cities had been burning for days, their skies filled with enemy ships and fire, yet now the sky was alive with explosions. But this time it was the enemy that was burning. One of the survivors, a technician named Kalar, watched from the ruins of a bunker through a cracked viewport. He saw the dark shapes of the new ships moving above the clouds. They did not carry any symbols. He did not know who they were. But something about the way they fought was different. There was no hesitation, no waste of fire. Every movement was clean, fast, perfect. It was like watching a machine of war built for one purpose: to destroy evil. The Dominion tried to adapt. They were not cowards. They had conquered countless systems before, but nothing in their long history had prepared them for this kind of enemy. The humans were not using the same old tactics. They did not try to take ground slowly or send out peace calls. They hit hard and vanished before counterfire could reach them. The Karth captains screamed into their comms, ordering ramming maneuvers and desperate counterattacks, but every time they moved, the human fleet was already ahead of them, as if every move had been predicted before it happened. The Dominion ships that tried to escape found their exit routes blocked by stealth frigates, whose cloaked forms appeared only long enough to fire before fading back into darkness. The battle went on for hours, though, for those watching. It felt like minutes. The humans fought with precision, but also with something more, something the aliens could feel, even if they could not describe it. It was not anger. It was not pride. It was something heavier, a deep sense of duty and sorrow, as if every human ship carried the memory of old wars and fallen worlds inside them. They were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting because no one else would. Down on the surface of Tylar Prime, the remaining defenders began to rise from the bunkers where they had hidden. The bombardment had stopped for the first time in days. The rumble of explosions was replaced by the distant sound of thunder as pieces of enemy ships fell burning through the atmosphere. The aliens ran into the open air and saw light streaks racing across the sky. The last of the Dominion vessels trying to flee, while the human ships followed them like hunters. The air smelled of ozone and dust, but it also smelled of hope. Inside the human fleet, the officers reported victory after victory, but there was no celebration. The admiral only nodded with a tired expression. He knew this was only one battle among many, and he also knew that the message they had just sent would echo through the galaxy. Humanity had revealed itself to the old powers, and there would be no going back. He gave new orders to the fleet to begin rescue operations, to send dropships and medics to the planet below. He told them to help everyone. They found no matter the species or the flag. Within minutes, the human transports began to fall toward the surface. Their engines glowing blue against the red clouds, they landed near the ruined cities and began pulling survivors from the rubble. The aliens were cautious at first. Some had been taught that humans were dangerous, unpredictable beings from a wild world. But when they saw the medics kneeling to help the wounded, when they saw soldiers carrying alien children to safety, they began to understand something new. One alien leader approached a human officer, his body still covered in dust and burns, and asked why they had come, why they had risked so much for strangers. The officer simply looked at him and said, "Because you asked for help and we were listening." Above them, the cleanup of the battlefield continued. Drones collected debris from orbit. The remains of Dominion ships were scanned and destroyed, so no trace of their technology could be used again. The human fleet stayed silent. No signals sent, no broadcasts made to announce their victory. They did not need to speak. The sight of the broken Dominion fleet drifting in space was enough of a message to anyone watching from afar. Humanity had done what no other power had dared to do. They had faced the monster of the galaxy and won. As the fires of Telar Prime began to fade, the first sunlight in days broke through the heavy smoke clouds. The survivors looked up and saw the human ships hovering above them, blocking the stars. Their dark forms calm and steady like guardians. Watching from the heavens, it was then that they realized these strange beings from a far world had saved them. Not for gain, not for glory, but because that was who they were. They were humans, the ones who could not stand to watch others fall, when they had the power to stop it. On the bridge of the Resolute, the Admiral stood alone, looking out into the endless sky. The wreckage of battle drifted quietly in the distance. His crew waited for the next command. But he said nothing for a long time. He thought about the message that had started it all, that one small call for help from a dying world. It had reached them across the dark, and they had answered. Now he wondered how many other voices were out there, waiting unheard. He knew this was only the beginning, and that the Dominion would not forget what had happened today. But for now there was peace in this one system, and that was enough. He gave the final order for the day, a simple command that carried through every ship in the fleet: begin rescue and repair operations. Engines hummed softly as the massive ships adjusted orbit. Medics and engineers worked without rest. The wounded were treated, the broken were comforted, and the dead, both human and alien, were given quiet honor. No speeches were made, no banners raised. The humans did their work quietly, and when the job was done, they would leave just as silently as they had arrived. They did not expect thanks or recognition. They only wanted to make sure that when the next call came, someone would still be alive to send it. In the coming days, stories would spread across the stars of the fleet that appeared from nowhere and erased an empire in hours. Traitors, soldiers, and refugees would speak the same line again and again. Humanity had come, and the enemy was gone, and those who listened would remember that somewhere among the endless stars, there was a species that did not wait for permission to do what was right. They simply acted, and that was why the galaxy would never be the same again. The fires on Telar Prime had finally started to die down. Smoke still rose from the broken cities, and the air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and dust. The human fleet hung above the planet in silent formation, their dark ships blocking. Out the sun below them, dropships moved through the air carrying supplies, soldiers and medics to help the survivors. The battle was over, but the work had just begun on the surface. The people who had survived the Dominion attack looked up with fear and confusion. They had seen many armies in their lifetime, but none like this one. The humans had come without warning, fought without mercy, and now they were rebuilding without asking for anything in return. The ground was covered with debris from the fallen ships. The streets were filled with shattered glass and the ruins of buildings that had once touched the clouds. The aliens walked slowly between the wreckage, some of them still weak and wounded, others searching for lost family members. When they saw the humans, they hesitated. The soldiers wore dark armor, their helmets smooth and featureless. They looked more like shadows than living beings. Yet when they spoke, their voices were calm and kind. They gave food and water to anyone who asked. They carried the injured on their backs through the smoke and rubble, and they never looked for reward. One of the human medics was helping a small alien child whose arm was broken. The child was crying and afraid, but the medic spoke softly, telling them that it would be fine, that they were safe now. The translator on the medic's wrist changed the words into the alien tongue, but the tone alone carried comfort nearby. A group of engineers worked on restoring the main power grid there. Machines hummed quietly as they repaired broken lines and set up portable generators. They did not rest even as the sun rose and fell again. They kept working, their faces dirty but focused, because they knew that survival was more than just winning a battle. It was helping people live again. In orbit, the human commanders were reviewing the aftermath. The Dominion fleet had been completely destroyed. There were no survivors. From their side scanners showed thousands of wrecks floating in the dark, each one a reminder of what humanity could do when provoked. The admiral stood at the main display looking at the reports that came in from every ship. His expression was hard, but his eyes showed fatigue. He knew this victory would echo across the stars. Every empire, every faction, every race that had feared the Dominion would now know that humans had done what no one else dared to do. Messages began to flow in from nearby systems. Some were cautious. Others were curious. Some simply wanted to know why the humans had come. They asked if this was the start of a new human empire, or if Earth had finally decided to conquer the galaxy. But humanity sent no answer. They had not come for power. They had come because a voice had asked for help. That was all they needed. The admiral ordered his fleet to remain silent and to focus on rebuilding efforts. Every ship that had carried weapons now carried medical supplies. Every soldier who had fired in anger now worked to build shelters for the homeless. As days passed, the people of Tylar Prime began to understand who their saviors were. They learned that humans came from a distant system, one that had suffered its own wars and losses. They learned that humanity had built its strength, not from conquest but from survival. From learning how to rise after every fall, some of the aliens could not understand why such a powerful race would risk so much for others. But when they saw the humans working side by side with them, eating the same ration, sleeping on the same ground, they began to believe that maybe the stories about them being dangerous were wrong. Maybe humanity was something else entirely. One evening, as the twin moons rose over the battered horizon, a small group of alien leaders gathered near the remains of their old government hall. The building was half destroyed but still standing. A human officer arrived at their request. His armor was scratched and his face tired, but he stood tall. They thanked him for what his people had done, but also asked what humanity wanted in return. The officer smiled faintly and said nothing for a moment. Then he replied that humanity wanted nothing. They had not come for land or riches. They had come because someone had to stand against evil because no one else had, and that was all there was to it. The aliens were silent for a long time after that. Some bowed their heads. Others wept quietly. Back in orbit, the fleet was preparing for departure. They had already done what they came to do. The survivors were safe. The Dominion forces were gone and the planet was beginning to recover. Human engineers had built communication beacons so that Tylar Prime could reach other friendly systems again they had left behind. Supplies and machines that could help rebuild the cities before leaving. The admiral gave a final order that would be remembered for years. Leave everything that can help them, take only what we must. As the fleet made ready to leave, one of the younger officers asked the admiral if they should send a message to the Dominion warning them to stay away. The admiral shook his head slowly and said, "There is no need, they already understand the message, their silence is enough." And he was right. The Dominion, who had once filled the stars with their cruelty, had gone quiet. Their command channels were empty, their fleets hidden in deep space. They had seen what happened to their proud armada, and they would not forget it. The galaxy was watching, and for the first time in generations, the Karth Dominion had known fear. The human ships began to rise from orbit one after another, engines glowing softly against the black of space from the surface. The aliens watched them go, their eyes following the trails of light until they vanished into the sky. Some reached out their hands as if to thank them, even though the humans could not hear it. The child who had been helped by the medic stood next to their mother holding a small human-made bandage as a reminder of the strange kind beings who had come from the stars when no one else would in the command deck of the Resolute. The admiral sat alone for a moment, watching the planet grow smaller through the viewport. He thought about all the battles humanity had fought, all the times they had been underestimated and all the times they had risen anyway. He thought about the message that had started it all, a simple cry for help sent by desperate people, and he wondered how many more messages like that were waiting out there in the dark. He knew that humanity could not save everyone, but he also knew that as long as they had ships and people willing to fight, they would always try. As the fleet entered folded space, the stars stretched into lines of light and the blackness of the void swallowed them once again. The communications went silent, the screens dimmed, and only the hum of the engines remained. It was peaceful, almost calm. The humans did not celebrate. There was no need. They had done what had to be done, and now they would return home to prepare for whatever came next. Weeks later, news of what happened at Tyler Prime spread through the galaxy. Every station, every colony, every council spoke of the battle. Some called it the miracle at Tyler Prime. Others called it the day the sky burned, but one thing was clear. The legend of humanity had begun to grow. Stories spread of ships that appeared out of nowhere and destroyed the enemy in a single day. Stories of soldiers who gave water to children, of medics who treated aliens with care, of engineers who rebuilt homes before leaving without a trace. To many, they were not just warriors. They were something greater. A force that fought for those who could not fight for themselves. On Earth, when the fleet finally returned, there were no grand celebrations, no fireworks. The people welcomed their soldiers quietly with pride and relief. The news channels spoke of the victory, but the commanders refused to boast. They knew that their strength was not in their weapons, but in their will to act when others would not. The admiral stood before the council and gave a short report. Then he requested that no monuments be built, no medals be given. He said that what they had done should be remembered not as glory but as duty. The council agreed, and the meeting ended in silence. That night, the admiral walked through the observation deck of the spaceport. He looked out at the stars, knowing that somewhere out there the Dominion was regrouping, planning, perhaps even plotting revenge, but he was not afraid. He knew that if the darkness ever rose again, humanity would answer once more. They always did, because that was who they were. Not conquerors, not saviors, not monsters, just people who refused to look away when the universe called for help. Far away on Tyler Prime, the rebuilt cities slowly began to shine again. Lights flickered in the windows. Laughter returned to the streets, and every night, the people would look up at the stars, remembering the black fleet that had come to save them. They would tell their children about the humans, the strange, fierce, kind people who fought like thunder and left like ghosts. And in every story they told, there was always one truth: when the humans came, the war ended instantly and peace returned to the sky. The human fleet moved through the silent dark once more, their engines glowing faintly against the black sky. They were heading home. But even as they crossed the stars, they knew that the story of Tyler Prime had already reached every corner of the galaxy. People everywhere were speaking about the humans. Some called them saviors, some called them monsters of justice, and others whispered that the old balance of power was broken forever. The Karth Dominion had vanished from sight, their ships gone, their systems quiet, but everyone knew they were not gone completely. They were hiding, waiting for a chance to rise again, and humanity knew that day would come. On board the Resolute, life had settled into a strange calm. The crew worked in silence, maintaining the systems, recording the data from the battle and scanning the space around them. Though the battle had ended, the tension remained, because victory always came with a price. The admiral sat in his command chair looking at the reports from the rescue teams. Thousands of lives had been saved, but thousands more were lost. Every time he saw those numbers, he felt the same heavy weight in his chest. He had seen war before, he had lost friends before, but this time it was different. This time they had not fought for their own survival. They had fought for strangers, and that made the losses feel even deeper. As they traveled through, folded space messages from across the galaxy continued to arrive. Some were simple words of thanks from alien governments, some were pleas for help from colonies now fearing the return of the Dominion, and a few were warnings from powerful empires who told humanity to stay within their own borders, to not interfere with the order of the galaxy. But the humans did not respond. They knew that order built on fear was not peace they had seen. Too many worlds destroyed because no one dared to fight back. The fleet continued its journey in silence. Their destination was Earth, but their minds were already on what might come next. Back on Earth, the news of the victory had reached every city and colony. People gathered in parks and stations to watch the broadcasts showing the broken Dominion ships and the blue planet of Tyler Prime slowly healing. Humanity felt pride but also unease. They knew the galaxy was watching, and some feared that others might see them as a threat rather than a savior. In the great halls of the Terran Council, leaders debated for days. Some argued that humanity should return to isolation, that they had done their duty and now must protect their borders. Others believed they had a responsibility to stand as defenders for those who could not defend themselves. The arguments grew heated, but in the end they decided to wait for the fleet to return before making any final decision. As the ships neared the Sol system, the stars ahead shimmered like gold. The homeworlds were waiting planets filled with families waiting for their loved ones. Messages were exchanged between ships and stations, each one filled with simple words of relief and love. "We made it. We are coming home," on the main deck of the Resolute. The crew watched Earth grow larger through the viewport. The sight of blue oceans and white clouds filled them with quiet peace after all the fire and chaos of war. It felt unreal to see beauty again. When the fleet entered orbit, they were greeted not with parades or music, but with silence. The people watched from the ground as the black ships floated above the sky like dark guardians. The admiral spoke briefly to the council through the main channel. He gave his report in simple words describing what had been done and what had been lost. When he finished, there was a long pause, then the council thanked him and the fleet for their service. They did not speak of medals or ceremonies, they only said one thing: "The galaxy will remember what you have done, and humanity must be ready for what comes next." For a time, it seemed that peace might hold. The Dominion was quiet, and trade between systems began again. Telar Prime slowly rebuilt, with human help. The cities were rising once more, and the people there had started to call the humans the Keepers of Light. Small statues were built in their honor. Not grand monuments, but simple markers carved from the metal of fallen ships, each one engraved with the same words: "They came from the stars and ended the darkness." Those who passed by would touch the cold metal and whisper their thanks. But far beyond the peaceful systems, the Dominion was not idle. Their pride had been shattered, their leaders humiliated, and their fleets destroyed. But the Dominion was old and patient. In the deep corners of space, they began to rebuild, their power gathering what ships and resources they could. Their warlords met in secret. Furious and afraid, they spoke of revenge, of reclaiming the fear they had lost. They studied the recordings of the battle, trying to understand how the humans had defeated them so quickly. They could not believe it was possible that such a young species could destroy them. In a single day, they decided that next time they would be ready. Back on Earth, the scientists who studied the wreckage of captured Dominion ships began to understand the scale of what they had faced. The technology was ancient and cruel, built for domination, not survival. The humans learned much from it, but they did not try to copy it. Instead, they used it to improve their defenses. They knew that if war returned, it would be greater than before, and they wanted to be ready. Every shipyard in the Union began working day and night, building new vessels stronger and faster than ever before. The fleet that had saved Telar Prime would soon be joined by many more. The admiral spent his days moving between the colonies, inspecting the new ships and training new officers. He did not enjoy power or fame. He simply believed that their duty was not finished. He often thought about the words he had said on Telar Prime because someone had to. He knew that those words were true, and that someday another world would send another call for help. And when that happened, humanity must be ready again. He wrote reports to the council, urging them to stay alert, to keep the fleets active and the people united. Not through fear, but through purpose. Among the people of the Union, a quiet change began to grow. They no longer saw themselves as isolated or small. They had looked into the dark and faced what others feared and won. Their children grew up hearing stories not of conquest but of courage. Stories about soldiers who crossed the stars to save lives they had never known. It became part of who they were when they looked up. At the night sky, they no longer saw emptiness. They saw responsibility. Months passed and the calm continued, but deep space patrols began to report strange readings. Fleets moving in distant sectors. Trade ships disappearing, signals going dark. The signs were small at first, but the admiral recognized them for what they were. The early steps of war. He gathered his commanders and showed them the data. Their faces hardened. They knew what it meant. The Dominion was returning stronger and angrier than before, but this time they would not find their prey unprepared. Humanity had learned from every battle, every loss, every victory. They were ready to face whatever came. One night, as the fleet prepared to launch again, the admiral stood on the observation deck of the Resolute. He looked at the stars, thinking about all that had happened since Telar Prime. He thought about the people they had saved, the lives lost, the cities rebuilt, and the message that had spread across the galaxy. Humans were not gods or monsters. They were simply what the galaxy needed them to be. The storm that arrived when no one else would stand. He knew that whatever happened next would shape the future of not just humanity, but everyone who lived under the Same stars. Far away, the Dominion gathered in the shadows, their warlords giving new orders, their shipyards burning with activity. They were coming again, this time with hatred, not pride. They believed they could erase the shame of their defeat. They believed they could destroy the humans, but they did not understand humanity. They did not understand that humans did not fight for power or wealth. They fought because they could not ignore suffering. They fought because they remembered what it felt like to be helpless, and because of that, they would never stop fighting. The stars waited quietly as both sides prepared once more. The galaxy watched and whispered. The same question: would the humans return to battle if called upon? And the answer was already known, because somewhere deep in the darkness a signal began to move again. A faint voice lost among the stars. Another cry for help from another world. And as it reached the Terran relays, lights began to glow across the fleet stations. Alarms hummed softly, and the engines of the great ships started to awaken once again. Because when the stars called for help, humanity always answered. The stars were quiet, but the silence felt heavy, as if the galaxy itself was holding its breath. Deep in space, the human fleet began to move again. Their ships shining like small suns against the darkness, each one carried men and women who had seen the last great battle and survived. Some of them were veterans from Telar Prime. Others were new faces, young and full of determination. They all knew that peace had never been real. It had only been a pause between storms. And now that pause was ending. Reports were coming in from the outer systems. Colonies burning, trade routes cut off, stations destroyed with no survivors. Everyone knew who was responsible. The Karth Dominion had returned. The first attack came without warning. A small research station near the edge of human territory vanished from all channels when a patrol ship arrived. They found nothing but drifting wreckage and frozen bodies. The Dominion had left their mark again. The same brutality, the same cruel precision, the same message: we are back. The news spread fast through the colonies. Fear began to rise again, and the Council on Earth called for immediate action. They remembered how close the galaxy had come to falling before, and they refused to let it happen again. Orders were sent to every fleet and base. Humanity was going to war once more. The admiral who had led them at Telar Prime stood again at the command of the Resolute. He was older now, his hair gray and his eyes lined with exhaustion. But his mind was still sharp. He looked at the map of the outer systems and saw the pattern the Dominion was testing them, attacking small and weak targets, watching to see how the humans would respond. He knew they could not wait. If they allowed the Dominion to build momentum, the war would become endless. He gave the order to gather all available ships near the border. They would not hide behind walls. They would meet the enemy head-on. As the ships left orbit, people across the human colonies watched them rise through the clouds. The sight filled them with both fear and pride. Mothers and fathers stood in silence. Children waved at the sky, not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing that something great and terrible was beginning. Again, news broadcasts filled every screen, showing fleets preparing across different worlds. Thousands of voices spoke of courage and hope, and even those who had once feared humanity now sent their support, because everyone knew that if the humans fell, no one else would survive. The journey to the battlefront took days through the dark lanes of folded space. The fleet moved in formation, each ship following the glowing trails of the others. Messages passed between them. Small words of comfort, jokes, promises of return, and silent prayers for what was to come. When they reached the edge of human space, they saw the wreckage of the colonies destroyed by the Dominion, burned cities, cracked planets, drifting stations. The admiral looked at the destruction and felt the same cold anger he had felt years ago. This was not war, this was slaughter, and it had to end. The Dominion fleet appeared soon after, massive and dark like a storm of steel and fire. They had rebuilt their forces faster than anyone expected. Their ships were larger and deadlier, their weapons burning brighter. But what they did not understand was that humanity had changed too. The humans had learned from every battle and every mistake. Their ships were smaller, but faster. Their weapons smarter, their unity stronger. When the two fleets met in the shadow of a dying star, the stars around them turned red from the light of the explosions. The battle began without speeches or warnings. Beams of light tore across the darkness. Missiles arced through the void, and the soundless fury of war filled the space between them. The humans moved like a living storm. each ship covering the others, every pilot trusting the next. They fought not for conquest, but for protection for every voice that had called for help. The admiral gave short, calm orders, his voice steady. Even as his ship shook from enemy fire, his crew followed him without hesitation. The Dominion tried to crush them with numbers, but the humans adapted fast, turning the enemy's strength into weakness, striking where they were slow and vulnerable. Hours passed the battle, spreading across the system. Thousands of ships locked in deadly dance. Human destroyers darting between massive Dominion cruisers, cutting their engines and firing at close range. The Dominion commanders shouted orders, trying to control the chaos. But the humans were everywhere, unpredictable and fearless. They had no single pattern, no weakness to exploit. And behind every maneuver there was one clear truth: they would rather die than let the Dominion win again. In the middle of the chaos, a Dominion warlord broadcast a message across all channels, his voice filled with arrogance, calling the humans weak and arrogant, claiming they would fall as all others had before. But his speech was cut short when the Resolute appeared out of the shadows and fired a single concentrated beam that tore through his flagship, breaking it apart. In a blinding burst, the human fleet saw the explosion and pushed harder. The balance of the battle shifted and the Dominion line began to break. They tried to retreat, but the humans pursued them not for vengeance but to make sure they could never return to harm anyone again. By the time the battle ended, the system was filled with wreckage, burning debris, floating among the stars. Human ships drifted silently through the field, scanning for survivors and damaged vessels. The admiral stood by the viewport, watching the ruins of the Dominion fleet disappear. Into the darkness there was no cheer, no celebration, just quiet relief. They had won again. But at a terrible cost. Many ships were lost and thousands of lives gone. The price of protecting peace was always heavy, and the admiral knew it would only grow heavier. When the reports came in, he read them one by one. Every ship, every crew, every name lost, each line burned into his memory. He did not see them as numbers, but as people who had believed in something greater than themselves. When the council contacted him again, he gave his report in the same simple way he always did, objective, direct, and honest. When they asked what came next, he said only one thing: they will return again one day, and when they do, we must be ready. The council nodded and ended the transmission. In the days that followed, rescue ships worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from wreckage, repairing damaged systems, and collecting the fallen for burial. Ceremonies were held across the fleet. Every crew stood in silence as the names of the lost were read one by one, the stars above them shining softly like candles in the void. It was a moment of grief, but also unity. The humans had seen again what it meant to stand together, and no one would forget it. As the fleet began its journey back to Earth, the admiral spent hours alone in his cabin looking at the stars. He thought about all that had happened, about the first call for help, about Tylar Prime, about the battles that followed. He knew that humanity had crossed a line long ago. They were no longer just explorers or survivors. They had become guardians of the galaxy, not by choice but by duty, because when others turned away, humanity always answered. He wondered if that was their true nature to be. The storm that cleared the darkness. When the fleet arrived home, the people waited again in silence. The ships entered orbit, battered and scarred, but victorious. The admiral watched as shuttles descended, carrying the wounded back to their families. The sight brought both pride and sadness to his heart. He knew that for every ship that returned, another was lost, and for every victory there was always another battle waiting beyond the stars. On the surface of Earth, the council met once more. This time they did not argue. They all agreed that humanity could never again hide behind its borders. They had to remain ready to protect those who could not protect themselves. They decided to create a permanent defense alliance, a network of fleets and stations that would guard the outer systems, not just for humans but for all who lived in peace across the galaxy. The admiral was asked to lead it, and though he was tired and worn, he accepted because he knew that peace could only survive if someone was willing to stand for it. As the meeting ended, the stars outside the great window of the council hall shone brighter than ever before. The admiral looked up and whispered quietly to himself that humanity would never stop answering the call. Somewhere out there, another world might one day need them, and when that time came, the fleets would rise again, engines lighting up the dark once more, because that was what humanity did. They entered the battlefield not for glory, not for conquest, but to end the darkness before it could spread again. And in that quiet, endless space, the story of their courage would continue forever.